On the evening of April 26, 2005, a chilling discovery was made inside a quiet home in Durham, North Carolina. Inside the Abaroa residence, Janet Abaroa's lifeless body was found, sprawled across the floor, a single gunshot wound taking her life. In a cruel twist, her 6-month-old son, Caden, lay peacefully asleep in the next room, blissfully unaware of the nightmare unfolding just beyond his door. The serenity of that quiet night was shattered, leaving only the haunting question, who could have killed Janet, and why? Janet was not just another victim, not just another name in a growing list of unsolved murders. She was a young woman with a future. Born into a large, tight-knit Mormon family in Virginia, Janet had always been the kind of person who inspired others with her intelligence and athleticism. She had excelled in school, pursued sports with passion, and had dreams as big as her heart. Even in the whirlwind of her early adulthood, with marriage and motherhood, Janet kept her focus on what truly mattered, her family. The promise of a bright future seemed endless, especially when she welcomed her son, Caden, into the world just 6 months before her untimely death. It was a life full of potential, a life filled with love and hope. Yet, all of it came to an abrupt and tragic halt. The question loomed large: how could this vibrant woman, a devoted mother with everything to live for, meet such a violent and senseless end? And perhaps even more haunting, why was Caden untouched, spared from whatever fate had befallen his mother? The scene left behind was a puzzle that demanded answers. No signs of forced entry. No immediate clues to point to a clear suspect. The only thing more haunting than the violence of the crime was the uncertainty that surrounded it. Who would want to hurt Janet? And why? The more the investigators dug into Janet's life, the more questions arose. Everyone had something to say about Janet, her family, friends, co-workers, even neighbors, but not one of them seemed to know the truth. All anyone could say with certainty was that Janet didn't deserve to die like this. But who was the person who had the answer to this horrific question? Who could have known enough about her life to end it with such callousness? The evening of April 26, 2005, in Durham, North Carolina, began like any other, but what would unfold inside the Abaroa home that night would soon become a haunting mystery. The discovery of Janet Abaroa's lifeless body sent a chill through the community. Her body was found in a bedroom, sprawled unnaturally across the floor, a single gunshot wound taking her life. The discovery was made by her husband, Raven Abaroa, who had just returned to their home. But perhaps the most chilling detail was the presence of their 6-month-old son, Caden, peacefully sleeping in the next room, untouched by the horror that had befallen his mother. The juxtaposition of the violence of Janet's fate and the innocence of her child would linger in the minds of everyone who heard the story. A young, vibrant mother, brutally murdered, while her child slept soundly nearby. Janet Abaroa was more than just a statistic, more than just another victim in the ever-growing list of tragedies. She was a woman full of promise, a young woman whose future seemed so bright. Born into a large, loving Mormon family in Virginia, Janet had always been an ambitious and driven individual. She excelled academically, stood out in sports, and had an energy and presence that made everyone around her admire her. Her love for her family and her dreams of motherhood were at the forefront of her life, and she embraced both motherhood and her role as a wife with full-hearted devotion. Janet had recently given birth to her son, Caden, and she was on the verge of building the life she had always dreamed of. A woman who had so much to live for, yet her life had been stolen in the most violent of ways. Her death raised the most unsettling of questions. Why was Janet, a young mother with no apparent enemies, found dead in her own home? What could have driven someone to take her life? And, perhaps most perplexing of all, why was her son, Caden, unharmed? Was the killer's intent solely to murder Janet, or was there something deeper, something darker, behind this brutal act? As detectives arrived on the scene, the investigation began to take shape. Every inch of the Abaroa home was meticulously examined. Forensic experts gathered evidence from the crime scene, including potential fingerprints, DNA samples, and any trace evidence that might have been left behind by the killer. The murder weapon, a gun, was eventually recovered, but little else about the weapon or the crime itself offered immediate answers. It was as if the killer had taken great care to cover their tracks. The scene was disturbingly clean, offering few clues to the investigators who were left with more questions than answers. One of the first people to be interviewed was Raven Abaroa, Janet's husband. Raven, who had arrived home to find his wife's body, was visibly distraught. He told police that he had been at work all day and had left the office just after 5 p.m. He confirmed that he had called Janet shortly before returning home to check in. His alibi seemed to hold up under initial scrutiny. However, Raven's behavior during the interview raised a few eyebrows. While he was clearly shaken, there were moments where his responses seemed rehearsed, almost too polished. His story did not seem to be entirely consistent, and detectives began to wonder if there was more to his role in the tragedy than he was letting on. The police broadened their investigation, speaking with Janet's family, friends, and co-workers. Through these interviews, a troubling picture of the Abaroa marriage began to emerge. The relationship between Janet and Raven had been far from perfect. Raven, it seemed, had been struggling with his own personal issues. Financial difficulties had put a strain on their marriage, and whispers of infidelity began to surface. Some of Janet's close friends even mentioned that she had confided in them about problems in her relationship with Raven, though she never seemed to consider divorce as an option. But the most alarming discovery came when detectives looked into Janet's life insurance policy. It was a policy that had been taken out just months before her death, a policy in which Raven was listed as the primary beneficiary. The amount of the policy was substantial, and detectives could not help but wonder if financial gain might have been the real motive behind Janet's murder. Was it possible that Raven had something to do with his wife's death in order to collect on the life insurance policy? The investigation took a deeper turn when the detectives focused their attention on Raven himself. They uncovered disturbing details about his past, including allegations of violent behavior and a string of unresolved issues from his earlier life. Was Raven capable of murder? Or had someone else killed Janet, and if so, why was Raven's name so prominently tied to the case? As the weeks passed, the lead detectives continued to chase down every lead and piece of evidence they could find. Detective James Cummings, the lead investigator on the case, was known for his meticulous approach and unwavering determination to find the truth. Cummings and his team worked tirelessly, following up on every lead and trying to make sense of the conflicting reports they received. They interviewed neighbors who described hearing unusual sounds the night of the murder, and they dug deeper into Raven's life, questioning his alibi and the possibility of hidden motives. The detectives were relentless. They knew that the truth had to be somewhere, hidden beneath the layers of confusion and secrecy. But as the months passed, the case seemed to hit a standstill. No direct evidence linked Raven to the murder, and Janet's death remained a mystery, as if the answers were just beyond their grasp. It became clear that this was not going to be a simple case to solve. There were more questions than answers, more leads than conclusions. As the investigation continued, the detectives were faced with the stark reality that they might never uncover the truth. But one thing was certain, they would not give up on finding justice for Janet Abaroa. The quiet evening of April 26, 2005, would forever be etched in the memories of those connected to the Abaroa family. In the calm suburban neighborhood of Durham, North Carolina, Janet Abaroa's life was taken in the most violent way possible. The brutal discovery of her body sent shockwaves through the community. Janet was found in the comfort of her own home, her lifeless form sprawled on the floor, a single gunshot wound to her chest. Yet, the most haunting part of the scene was not just the brutality of her death, but the serenity of the room next door. Her 6-month-old son, Caden, lay innocently asleep, unaware that his mother would never again wake to comfort him. The juxtaposition of such violence and the vulnerability of a child in the next room was a sight that would never leave those who arrived at the scene. Janet Abaroa was not merely another victim of a senseless crime. She was a young woman whose life had been filled with promise. Born into a large, loving Mormon family in Virginia, Janet's upbringing was marked by strong values and close family bonds. She excelled in school, demonstrating not only intelligence but athleticism, becoming known for her competitive nature and zest for life. She was someone with dreams of a family, a career, and a future full of potential. Janet had recently entered the chapter of motherhood, welcoming her son, Caden, into the world. Her love for her son and her dedication to raising him filled her life with joy. Janet's future seemed as bright as any young woman's could be, until that fateful evening when it was abruptly extinguished. Her death raised immediate and unsettling questions. Who would want to kill Janet Abaroa? What could have driven someone to take the life of such a promising young woman? And the most perplexing question of all, why was her son, Caden, left untouched, unharmed, as if the killer had no interest in him? Was it possible that Janet's death had been a random act of violence, or was there something more sinister at play, something deeper than a simple robbery gone wrong? As detectives arrived at the scene of the crime, they were met with a disturbing reality: no immediate clues, no signs of forced entry, no obvious reason why anyone would have targeted Janet. The investigation began with the basics, collecting forensic evidence, documenting the crime scene, and attempting to uncover any potential leads that could explain the horrific tragedy. Forensic experts worked tirelessly, scouring the scene for any physical evidence, while investigators tried to piece together the events leading up to Janet's death. They found the murder weapon, a gun, but it raised as many questions as it answered. No fingerprints, no DNA from an unknown third party, everything seemed to suggest the killer had known exactly what they were doing. They had left little behind. The next step was to interview those closest to Janet. Raven Abaroa, her husband, was the first to be questioned. Raven had arrived home that evening to find his wife's body, and his reaction was one of complete devastation. He immediately called 911 and tried to perform CPR, but it was too late. Raven's alibi was consistent with his story. He claimed he had been at work throughout the day and had called Janet shortly before returning home. However, detectives were quick to notice inconsistencies in his statements. His behavior during the interview seemed unusual. There were moments where he appeared too controlled, too composed for someone who had just discovered the body of his wife. His responses were often vague, and some of his answers didn't match up with what the physical evidence suggested. As investigators delved deeper into Raven and Janet's relationship, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Janet's family and friends painted a picture of a marriage under strain. Financial problems had been a constant in their lives, and there were whispers of possible infidelity on Raven's part. The couple had struggled with mounting debts and had even discussed the possibility of separation. But it was the discovery of a life insurance policy that really raised suspicion. Raven was listed as the primary beneficiary on a substantial life insurance policy taken out just months before Janet's death. The timing of the policy, coupled with the financial struggles the couple had faced, made some detectives begin to wonder if Raven's motive might have been more than just a domestic dispute. Could financial gain have played a role in Janet's murder? Raven quickly became the primary suspect, and his background was thoroughly examined. Investigators dug into his personal history, uncovering past allegations of violent behavior and questionable actions. Raven's financial troubles, coupled with the evidence of a life insurance policy, made him a prime target for further scrutiny. Was his behavior just the actions of a grieving husband, or was there something more sinister at play? The detectives' suspicions grew, and they were determined to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. However, the investigation did not stop with Raven. The detectives were mindful that the case was far from solved, and they began to look into other possible suspects. They considered anyone who might have had a motive to harm Janet. Could someone outside the family have had a grudge against Janet? Were there any unknown threats in her life? They conducted background checks on those who were close to Janet and Raven, but no new suspects emerged, at least not right away. As the investigation continued, detectives began to explore the psychological profiles of those involved. Was Raven's behavior a result of grief, or was there something darker at play? A thorough analysis of Raven's background revealed a man who had a history of controlling behavior and an occasional temper. Was it possible that the strain of financial pressure, combined with his infidelity, had pushed him over the edge? Was Janet's death a crime of passion or something more calculated, driven by financial desperation? As the months wore on, red herrings began to surface, clues that seemed promising but ultimately led nowhere. One neighbor claimed to have heard a strange noise coming from the Abaroa home the night of the murder, but the timeline didn't match up with the evidence. Another source claimed to have seen an unfamiliar car parked near the Abaroa home just before the crime, but no one could identify the vehicle or its owner. These false leads only served to deepen the mystery, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Despite the challenges, Detective James Cummings remained resolute in his pursuit of the truth. Cummings, a seasoned investigator known for his meticulous approach, had seen his fair share of cases, but the brutality of Janet's murder and the uncertainty surrounding the investigation weighed heavily on him. He worked tirelessly, chasing every lead and re-examining every piece of evidence. The case seemed to be spiraling, with no clear path forward, but Cummings refused to give up. He knew that somewhere, hidden in the shadows, was the key to unlocking the mystery of Janet Abaroa's death. As the investigation grew more complicated, one thing became clear: the murder of Janet Abaroa was far from a simple crime. It was a case that defied easy answers, a case that would leave its mark on everyone involved. The search for the truth continued, and Janet's family, friends, and the community held their breath, hoping for justice, but with every passing day, the question lingered: who killed Janet Abaroa, and why? The investigation into Janet Abaroa's tragic death had spiraled into a relentless pursuit of answers, with countless twists and turns. Weeks passed into months, and despite the detectives' best efforts, no new breakthroughs emerged. The case had reached a standstill. Raven Abaroa remained the prime suspect, but with no physical evidence directly linking him to the crime, investigators struggled to build a solid case. The mounting pressure to solve the case only deepened as the emotional toll on Janet's family and friends became ever more palpable. The uncertainty was unbearable, leaving those who loved Janet in limbo, desperately seeking justice. Yet, in the shadows of this painstaking investigation, an unexpected twist would finally lead to the resolution of one of the most haunting mysteries in Durham's recent history. It came not from an external source, but from a detail buried deep within Raven Abaroa's life that had somehow gone unnoticed, a seemingly trivial piece of information that would become the key to unlocking the entire case. Months after the murder, a breakthrough came when a team of forensic experts re-examined the evidence with fresh eyes. The gun found at the scene, initially deemed inconclusive, was reanalyzed using new ballistic technology. This led them to an astonishing discovery: the weapon had been legally purchased by Raven Abaroa himself. But what made this revelation particularly shocking was the discovery of a hidden discrepancy in the timing of the gun's purchase. Raven had bought the firearm shortly before Janet's death, an act that had gone unnoticed in the initial investigation, as it seemed like an ordinary purchase for personal protection. The forensic team uncovered a crucial detail: the gun had been used for multiple tests at a firing range before the murder, a detail Raven had never mentioned. More importantly, the evidence indicated that Raven had fired the weapon just hours before his wife was killed. He had lied to investigators about the details of his gun ownership. This, paired with the fact that no one else had access to the gun or had ever seen it in the home, began to chip away at Raven's carefully constructed alibi. A breakthrough had finally been made. Detective James Cummings, who had led the case with unwavering determination, was the first to put the pieces together. He called for a re-examination of Raven's actions the day of the murder. Cummings and his team quickly found that Raven's timeline had been inconsistent. His phone records, which had originally been thought to support his alibi, revealed that Raven had made several calls from his work phone just hours before Janet's body was found, calls that had gone unreported in his initial statement. The discrepancy between Raven's account of the evening and the actual evidence painted a much darker picture. The investigation finally took its next logical step. Raven Abaroa was arrested. The confrontation between Raven and the law enforcement officers who had spent months building a case against him was emotionally charged. Raven, who had once seemed distraught over the death of his wife, now appeared less like a grieving husband and more like a man backed into a corner. He was arrested in his home, his demeanor calm, but the air around him seemed charged with guilt. Janet's family, who had always held out hope that the truth would eventually emerge, were finally forced to confront the reality that the man they had once trusted was responsible for the murder of their beloved Janet. The weight of the moment was unbearable for them. Justice had come at a high emotional cost, and while they felt vindicated, they also carried the crushing realization that their lives would never be the same. As the case moved forward to trial, the emotional weight of the confrontation lingered. Janet's family, who had supported her through every phase of her life, now stood as witnesses to the unraveling of the man they had once considered family. In court, Raven's demeanor remained cold, distant, as if he had resigned himself to the inevitable. His defense team tried to paint a picture of a man who had been wronged by financial struggles and the pressures of his marriage, but the evidence presented against him was damning. The most compelling evidence came from the forensic experts who testified about the gun's connection to Raven, as well as the inconsistencies in his timeline and alibi. The prosecution also highlighted Raven's hidden financial difficulties and the life insurance policy he had taken out on Janet, drawing a clear connection between his motives and his actions. The jury, after weeks of testimony, deliberated for just over 10 hours before returning with a guilty verdict. Raven Abaroa was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice for Janet had been served, but the emotional toll on her family and friends was immeasurable. For them, the trial was not just about holding Raven accountable, it was about honoring Janet's memory and ensuring that her life, her dreams, and her legacy would not be overshadowed by the tragedy of her death. The trial concluded, but the impact of Janet's murder continued to reverberate through the lives of everyone who had known her. For her parents, her siblings, and her friends, the trial had been a painful but necessary step toward healing. Janet had been a bright light in their lives, and even in death, her story had managed to shine through, leaving behind a legacy of love, resilience, and hope. Janet's memory would forever serve as a reminder of the fragility of life, and the lengths to which some will go to conceal their darkest intentions. Though the trial was over, the scars left on the Abaroa family would remain, and the search for closure would continue. Justice had been served, but the true healing for Janet's family would take much longer. The question of why Raven had chosen to end his wife's life remained a mystery for those who loved her. No financial hardship, no marriage trouble, could ever justify such an act. And yet, in the end, the truth had emerged from the darkness, and the killer had been held accountable. The case of Janet Abaroa, though tragic, would serve as a reminder that justice can still be achieved, even when the truth seems buried too deep to uncover. The murder of Janet Abaroa left an indelible mark on the Durham community, its ripples felt far beyond the confines of the Abaroa family home. In a place once known for its tranquility, the crime shattered the illusion of safety that many residents had taken for granted. The brutality of Janet's death, her life snuffed out in her own home, with her innocent child sleeping just steps away, was a stark reminder of how violence can intrude into even the most ordinary, seemingly secure lives. The community, initially in shock, was left grappling with the incomprehensible nature of the crime, unsure of how such a tragedy could have unfolded in their midst. For the family and friends of Janet Abaroa, the impact was profound and devastating. Janet's parents, her siblings, and her extended family were forced to confront not just the loss of their beloved daughter and sister, but also the crushing realization that the man they had trusted, her husband, Raven, was the one responsible for ending her life. The pain of losing Janet was compounded by the betrayal they felt, a betrayal that would reverberate through every corner of their lives. Raven's arrest and conviction provided a sense of justice, but it could not undo the damage that had been done. Janet's family would forever carry the scars of her loss, each milestone her son Caden reached without her presence serving as a painful reminder of the mother he would never know. Friends of Janet, too, were left reeling from the aftermath. Many of them had considered Raven a friend, someone they trusted, someone they had never imagined capable of committing such an unspeakable act. The revelation that Janet's own husband had been responsible for her death shattered the bonds of trust that once held the community together. It forced those who had known Janet to confront difficult truths about the hidden struggles that might lie beneath the surface of a seemingly happy marriage. For them, the loss was not just of a friend, but of a piece of their own security, their belief that they could truly know those closest to them. The case, as tragic as it was, shed light on several broader themes that resonate far beyond the specifics of Janet's life. One of the most glaring lessons of the case was the insidious nature of domestic violence. While Janet's case did not fit the traditional narrative of domestic abuse, there were no visible signs of physical violence in the months leading up to her death. Emotional and financial pressures were a constant in her marriage to Raven. The strain of financial difficulties, coupled with Raven's alleged infidelity, created an environment ripe for tension and distrust. The murder was a tragic culmination of these unresolved issues, highlighting how unaddressed emotional and financial strain can slowly erode relationships, sometimes with devastating consequences. Janet's case serves as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous form of abuse is often the one that is unseen, the one that is hidden beneath the surface, allowed to fester until it finally explodes in a violent act. The financial pressures that played a central role in the case also speak to a larger, more universal problem. In Janet's marriage, mounting debts and financial struggles were a constant source of stress. Raven's decision to take out a life insurance policy on Janet, one that was intended to benefit him after her death, highlighted how dire financial situations can sometimes push individuals toward desperate, morally bankrupt choices. The case underscores the need for better communication and transparency in relationships, particularly when it comes to finances. Financial strain can create rifts in families and marriages, but when that strain is combined with deceit, it becomes a powder keg waiting to explode. Janet's death serves as a painful reminder that no amount of financial stress justifies the destruction of another person's life. The impact of infidelity was another central theme that emerged from the investigation into Janet's death. Although the exact nature of Raven's alleged infidelity was never fully uncovered, the rumors and suspicions surrounding it contributed to the breakdown of trust in the Abaroa marriage. In relationships where infidelity enters the equation, it can erode the very foundation of trust that holds the relationship together. For Janet, the emotional betrayal of her husband, compounded by financial difficulties, made her marriage a ticking time bomb. While infidelity alone may not have been the sole catalyst for Janet's murder, it undoubtedly played a role in the unraveling of her marriage and her eventual tragic fate. Finally, the case underscores the importance of justice. For Janet's family, the pursuit of justice for her murder was a long, painful journey, one that took years to reach its conclusion. The conviction of Raven Abaroa, though it provided a sense of closure, could not bring back the woman they had lost. But it did offer a vital lesson, that no matter how complicated or how painful the pursuit of truth may be, it is essential for the healing process. Janet's death was not in vain. Her story became a catalyst for raising awareness about domestic violence, financial strain, and the sometimes hidden darkness in seemingly perfect relationships. Justice, though never able to undo the tragedy, was the first step toward making the world a little safer for those left behind. It was a reminder that even in the face of profound loss, justice must always be pursued, not just for the victim, but for the community as a whole. In reflecting on Janet's case, one cannot help but feel a deep sense of loss for the woman who had so much potential, so much promise, and whose life was tragically cut short. But her story also carries with it an important message: the need for vigilance in our relationships, the need to recognize the signs of financial, emotional, and psychological strain before they spiral into something far worse. Janet's death, while a heartbreaking tragedy, holds valuable lessons for all of us. It is a call to action to pay attention to the small cracks in relationships, to address problems before they reach a boiling point, and to never ignore the warning signs of abuse, whether physical, emotional, or financial. For readers, the case of Janet Abaroa serves as a sobering reminder of the importance of empathy, communication, and vigilance in our personal lives. It urges us to take a closer look at the relationships around us, to recognize the warning signs, and to support those who may be silently struggling. It is a call to ensure that we, too, remain aware of the hidden pressures that can tear at the fabric of a life, sometimes beyond repair. Janet's story, in all its heartbreak and its lessons, urges us to protect those we love, and to never take for granted the safety of those around us.